Good morning, and thank you to everyone for tuning in to our first Healthcare and Life Sciences Committee meeting of 2021. I want to give a special thank you to our co-chairs, Chris Prochnow, Joe Chin, and David Geller for working to put together today's panel. And of course, to all of our panelists for taking time out of their schedules to join us today. Before we get started, just wanted to mention a few items of Building Congress business. First, we have some great events coming up in the month of March. Next week, our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee will be hosting a virtual meeting with newly appointed New York City DOT Commissioner Hank Gutman on March 10th. On March 18th, we'll be holding a virtual construction industry forum with Amtrak President Stephen Gardner. And that event will also feature the release of our latest report, Building Congress Across America. And then on March 25th, we will have the next installment of our Ascend webinar series, which will be a panel discussion on mass timber. As many of you may have heard, the Building Congress is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. To commemorate our centennial, we will be producing a variety of projects such as a book, a documentary, an exhibit, and this is all in addition to some special events. As part of this celebration, we are asking your members to submit photos, the older the better, from notable projects their firm has been involved with over the years. These photos will be featured as part of our social media campaign and possibly in other centennial related items. You can submit the photos to me. I'll provide my email in the chat. And now I will turn it over to our committee co-chair, David Geller, to get the program started.
David, you're muted.
I just had a whole conversation with myself. Thank you. Good morning. So to kick off today's meeting, I'd like to welcome Andrew Weinberg, Director of Business Development for LF Driscoll Healthcare and President of the New York City Chapter of Association of Medical Facility Professionals, to tell us a little bit about the AMFP. So Andrew, I'll hand it over to you.
I'm going to just share my slide. Hopefully everybody can see that. Good morning, and thank you very much, David. Thank you also to New York Building Congress and the Healthcare and Life Sciences Committee for giving me a couple of minutes to talk about AMFP. I am Andrew Weinberg. LF Driscoll Healthcare is my company. I'm their Director of Business Development, and I am also the founding president for the New York City chapter of AMFP. So what is AMFP? The Association of Medical Facility Professionals. Our tagline is the leadership in the healthcare built environment. We're for everyone in that healthcare built environment. And who does that include? So on the owner's side, that includes everyone who is involved in healthcare capital planning, designing construction, real estate, and facilities. On the service and product provider side, architects, engineers, contractors, owners, reps, specialty consultants, vendors of all types of products and services, basically everybody working in the healthcare market sector. Our number one goal is to build community for everyone in healthcare. We are filling a void that we had in New York City, and we are working together with other professional associations like the Building Congress. We're very proud to already have over 300 members in just our first 9 months, representing 12 healthcare systems in our region and over 200 companies that are doing work in the healthcare sector. We've hosted or co-hosted 8 events so far, working twice with the Commercial Observer, with Crew, with New, with the HCD conference, and AMFP National's 1-hour webcast series, and of course, our own. We have several events coming up, listed on the right. A full year planned out, in fact. The next one being the first of our new AMFP conversation series, which is essentially a fireside chat format on March 17th, which will focus on MWBE certification and opportunities in the healthcare sector. I also want to mention our next technical panel program on May 12th, which is focusing on the Climate Mobilization Act and how it affects the healthcare industry, which will be a continuation of today's conversation. We appreciate and hope to continue to be a resource and partner to the Building Congress and to the Healthcare and Life Sciences Committee and to the healthcare market sector overall. I want to thank you again for allowing me to talk about AMFP, and I'm going to turn it back over to David.
No, that's great. Thank you, Andrew. And now for the panel discussion, hospitals and local law 97, understanding the path to common ground. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and thank you to this great team for joining us today. We have Mr. Robert Berenger, Director of Plant Operations, Energy and Engineering, Facilities Management Division, Memorial Sloan Kettering. So welcome. Chris Colasanti, from the Associate Partner for JB&B. Jennifer Kearney, Executive Partner, Gotham 360. Stefan Knust, Senior Associate from ENIAD, and our moderator and co-chair, Healthcare and Life Safety Committee, Christopher Prochner, Partner, JB&B. So, gentlemen, take it away.
All righty, David, thank you. And on behalf of all of us, all of the co-chairs, clearly we want to welcome everybody taking some time out of their day to spend some time with us. This is the Healthcare Committee Spring panel discussion, a very relevant topic. We spoke about a lot of things last year with regard to COVID and emergency construction and infrastructure upgrades, tons of lessons learned. I hope I'm not jumping the gun saying it's post-pandemic, but we're just about there. And obviously a very relevant topic with Local Law 97 in terms of the balance between energy conservation, carbon footprint reduction. We're going to talk a lot about, we're going to start at a high level, 40,000 feet, and get into some real details and some real takeaways by the end of this discussion. We want to define what's fact, what's murk, and what's fiction. So this way everybody can get a common ground and understand what this law means as we embark on new construction projects. With that, I'd like to just jump right into it with the discussion. And Mr. Colasanti and Stefan, I'd like to tee this question up to you guys first. Just from a big picture standpoint, what is Local Law 97 all about? What does it mean to all of us?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Chris. I think the best thing to do is we have a couple slides that we have a sort of presentation that kind of outlines the high level facts about Local Law 97, how it works. And I think if we just spend a couple minutes on that first, I think it'll kind of set the stage for the rest of the discussion going forward. So I'm going to pull them up right now. Give me 1 second. You guys should be able to see it now. You see a big screen with a bunch of words, colors. All right.
Yep.
So to start off, right, Local Law 97 was passed in April of 2019 as part of the Climate Mobilization Act. This was a sweeping legislation bill that was put through that had a number of different facets, Local Law 97 being the one we're talking about today, and a very important one, but there are a bunch of things, and we can't get into all of it today. The two that I do want to mention, and Chris, this could be like a follow-up discussion or another panel, is the green roofs for new construction and also the building efficiency letter grades. The green roofs one requires that all new buildings and major renovations of roof projects be provided with PV and green roofs. So this affects basically all new builds, hospitals, any type, very important one that's in effect right now. And then the other one is the building efficiency letter grades. Everyone's familiar with, restaurants and the A, B, C, D letter grades from a health perspective. Same kind of thing for Energy Star score, right? Local 84 required Energy Star scores to be developed. The building efficiency letter grades post these letters outside of your building so the public can see how buildings are performing from an energy standpoint. So this is happening right now. Letters are up on buildings, and so this is kind of front and center. The main attraction, though, for today is Local Law 97. And so this slide kind of summarizes it, kind of the main points, right? It is a carbon emissions cap law, and it's focused around existing buildings. It's focused around buildings greater than 25,000 square feet. If you're under 25,000 square feet, you are exempt. The law does take effect on January 1st, 2024. I know that seems like it's far away, but it really isn't when you're talking about capital planning and infrastructure projects. And the carbon caps that the laws set become more stringent every 5 years, starting in 2024, right? The cap that exists in 2024 ratchets down over time, making this law become more difficult to comply with as time goes on. There is an annual compliance report that's required every year that you have to submit something. There are alternative compliant paths other than just meeting the requirements. We could dig into them a little bit or a lot today, depending on how much time we have. That could even be a follow-up discussion. And there are penalties, though, for non-compliance, and that's the real big thing here, right? Is there could be fines that could be levied against your project or your building. The way that the fines work, and this is sort of like a very simple equation, is that you have an actual emissions of your building based upon your utility consumption and the types of utilities that you're using. that actual emissions sets your performance. And then there's an allowed emissions that's prescribed in the law based on your building type and your area. And if your actual emissions are greater than your allowed, that difference gets multiplied by 268 tons and forms the basis of the fine. So it's really this hard cap. And those allowed emissions are going to, like I said, get reduced over time.
Do you
So
get a
breaking-
credit, Chris, if you're below?
No, there is no credit if you're
It's
below.
a
no.
one-way.
It's a one-way
Okay.
thing. Each year gets evaluated independently. And so thinking about those two things, the actual emissions and the allowed emissions, I want to break it down one step further. The actual emissions is based on your annual utility usage times the carbon coefficients associated with your utility. So for example, if your building consumes district steam, you see the carbon coefficient there, you multiply the steam consumption in BTUs times the coefficient, and that forms your carbon contribution associated with your steam consumption. The same thing for natural gas, for a boiler plant, the same thing for grid purchased electricity. And these carbon coefficients, these values are fixed in the law through this first compliance period of 2024 to 2029. After that, they may change. And that's important because the law is pushing us toward, it wants us to use electricity as a fuel. Now, when you look at these values here, it looks like the electricity number is really high. It doesn't sound like that's intuitive. But the idea is that over time, the electricity coefficient starting in 2030 is going to more accurately reflect the grid component at that time. And Jennifer's going to talk about that a little later. But we think the electricity value is going to decrease over time, thereby creating less exposure to you if you use electricity as a fuel versus other fuels. So again, the actual emissions, the carbon coefficients in the law times your usage. Your cap or your allowed emissions is based on your building occupancy type prescribed in the code times a limit of CO2 per square foot prescribed in the law based on your occupancy classification. And every single occupancy classification has a different limit. They're all different. That's reflective of the type of use and the amount of energy that type of building or space consumes. And the one that that comes to mind for today's discussion is obviously I2. You can see the value here. And what this says is that your building or your project, you have your square footage of your project, that's I2 occupancy, and you multiply it times that limit in the middle of the page of 2024, and that forms your carbon cap. If you have a multi-use project, you take the different individual occupancy times their respective square footages and you add that all together, and that forms the multi-use cap. The important point to note here, though, is that again, in 2024, there's a value, but look how much lower it goes in 2030. This is this ratcheting effect that we're talking about. For I2, it's about a 40% difference in the carbon cap, making it that much harder for you to meet your requirement as time goes on. Quick little case study. This is an office building, a real building in Midtown, right? The equations at the bottom I showed you before, the actual emissions minus the allowed emissions times the fine. This project was over. This is a particularly kind of bad one. It's about $1 a square foot, about a $2 million fine per year starting in 2025. And then in 2030, that gets even worse as that cap goes down, right? If the emissions stay the same and the cap goes down further, then that gap becomes larger and the fine becomes larger. And we can see this kind of in graphical form, the allowed emissions decreasing over time, and then the inverse proportion of the penalties increasing over time in orange. So this particular project, it's looking in 2035 like it could be a $6 million a year penalty. So this is kind of the framework of how the law works and how how the fines are levied. Probably a lot of questions here. There's a lot of unknowns about the law that we can talk about. But in general, I think the key takeaway here is that 80% of projects in New York City and existing buildings are going to kind of make it in that first compliance period where the carbon limits are a little higher. But when we go to that ratcheting down in 2030, about 80% of them are not going to make it and are going to pay fines. And those fines vary, obviously, based on how far over the limit you are. And there's a lot of rulemaking. The law requires that the DOB convene an advisory board, which they've done. The advisory board has subcommittees that are advising on all these different aspects that you see on the left of the slide about the law. Things like do hospitals get special consideration? How are fuel cells handled? What's going to happen with the energy grid? There's all these like little specific things that are being worked on in these subcommittees. Those subcommittees just provide feedback back to the advisory board and the DOB in 2023, with the idea that then potentially some changes or modifications might get rolled in by 2024. So there's some stuff that's up in the air kind of around these topics, but the framework is established about these carbon caps and the emissions. The goal is clear.
Is that the end of your slides, Chris? I just wanna
That's
make
it.
sure.
Yeah, that's the end of the intro, yeah.
Okay. Jen, in terms of the industry, right, we want to keep it high level, law-based and regulatory based. There's a ton of chatter in the industry. What is written and what is not written?
I think one of the most important things that is written but not defined is the carbon trading. And so you asked earlier, hey, what if you're under, do you get a credit? Well, you potentially could have a credit that is worth something to trade to someone who has an exceedance. But while a carbon trading scheme is mentioned in the law, it's not defined, and that's supposed to be coming out of one of the working groups. Basically, we should be seeing it in the first half of this year. I think we were expecting it originally in January, but with so many things, it is trailing a little bit behind.
Gotcha. And Bob, from your experience as an operator of a major hospital institution, what does the law mean to your institution? How are you guys dealing with what Colasanti just went through in terms of that penalty formula?
So in doing our numbers, we're pretty good for the first grouping from 24 to 20 to 29. Only our research building is looking like it's going to be getting around the $700,000 fine with business as usual using last year's data. Come 2030, if nothing changes and doing business as usual, we're looking at most of our buildings having fines in the $1 to $2 million to $3 million area. So for the institution, it would be approximately $7 million in 2030 in fines. That's doing business as usual. Now, we've always been going forward and trying to do energy efficiency projects, but as a hospital, you're doing 24/7. You have air change rates that are required by law, humidity required by law, laboratories, once through air systems. So there's a lot of energy usage, and how to get down to the numbers that the city is requiring or looking for, that's going to be a major stretch.
Bob, clearly the checkbook is not, unlimited. And the way you establish your baselines is you've got all your metering in place and you do all your data collection for whether it's electricity or fossil fuel consumption or steam, what have you. What do you do to plan out the next several years in terms of energy conservation measures? It's easy to say that. And are there studies that you employ? Are there low-hanging fruit approaches that you could share with other institutions that you would hit first?
So in the time that I've been here at MSK, for the 15 years, and then since Local Law 84 with the benchmarking and Local Law 87 with the energy audits and retro commissioning, the 87 reports we've basically used as our roadmap on lowering the energy of the buildings. It wasn't just pure energy audit and retro commissioning. We also did capital ECM possible projects. We've done, in our 2 research buildings, we've done demand ventilation control, lowering our air changes from 12 and 15 in the laboratories and 15 in the vivarium, down to 8 in the vivarium and 3 and 4 in the laboratories by using, measuring and quantifying the indoor air quality at all times. That, along with, doing chilled water demand, putting VFDs on fans, retro commissioning. One of our buildings, we were able to reduce the building by $2.5 million in energy costs. But that's the building that's still going to have a $700,000 fine come 2024. So what are we going to do? Working with a JB&B or the other consultant firms out there, we're planning on projects, getting roadmaps, working with our capital. This year, as David knows, we're quite short on capital. So it's continuing, keeping what we've done, educating our staff on proper building operations and energy management so that we can save on that side and not waste.
Gotcha. So what, I know you talked about a whole bunch of energy conservation measures and, I mean, the 101 of energy conservation is switch over to LEDs and replace all your steam traps, right? Those are two easy, low hanging fruit things. But when you start talking about, like you mentioned, some bigger picture items, once you get out of the easy things and you've got some issues, coming up in future years, like what future designs or what ideas does the institution have to implement on a bigger scale to help reduce energy over time? How do you transition off of fossil fuels and into electrification, if you will?
So to go electrification, you really have to get off of steam. And we're doing that for our three major buildings right now. We're in the process of going to a all hot water system for heating. That still leaves steam for our sterilization on our steam turbines, which we're looking at in phase 2. But by going to an all hot water system, the air handlers, the reheat systems, the domestic hot water, we're projecting to reduce the overall energy usage by $8.5 million a year. But that now puts us into the point that now we could do electrification on our boilers, but the numbers to say if we electrify our boilers just to do the heat loads that we have for the ventilation rates that we are required, we're looking at an additional 20 megawatts of power that needs to come into the institution. Where's that coming from? Does the city, Con Ed, have that ability? And what is the cost then to bring in that much power into the institution, not only counting the additional vaults and all the switchgear that we need?
Yeah. Can I just jump in here, Chris?
Sure.
Sure.
Bob, I completely, I hear you. This is a challenge that we're all facing, is that, if you just take all the heating loads of a building that are being served by steam or gas, and you take all those heating loads and you shift them over to electricity-based fuel, right? It's going to change the dynamic on the grid. It's going to potentially change the peak from the summer, maybe to the winter. It's going to, it's going to change the whole structure. And there's a lot of discussion and debate about it. And, think of what just happened in Texas. Everybody's talking about grid right now. So that's like front and center. And I guess as part, and I think you said it, Bob, but I want to say it again here, that, as part of any strategy to electrify, the first thing you have to do is reduce your usage, right off the bat. I mean, there's so many different ways, but that's the first thing you have to do. And then even after you reduce your usage, then it comes down to how do you use heat recovery or energy storage in such a way that you can reduce peak demands, so that when you do finally get to the electrification scenario, when you do have a heating load that you have to shift, it's as small as it can be, right? Obviously, there's a theoretical minimum, limit. There's heating loads that we have to satisfy, but it's how do you get it down as far as we can? Because only then, when we start shifting buildings over to the grid, right, it has to be the right load that gets shifted to the grid. Because if it's the load that we have today, it's not going to work.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. And the institution, in the time that I've spent here, we've reduced our energy usage square footage wise by 40% over the last 10 years. But there's still a lot to go. But how do you do it in buildings that were built in 1940 and have been continuously renovated, and every basically inch of space is being used?
Stefan's going to weigh in a couple of minutes on situations like that with new buildings versus renovations. But before we get there, I just wanted to address one of the questions that came in and kind of tee Jennifer up for both that question and a question that I have. We're talking about all these items at the institutional level for energy conservation and carbon footprint reduction. Are there any provisions in the law that make an institution be grandfathered or exempt?
So there are partial exemptions for low-income housing, and there is an exemption for houses of worship. Within the healthcare sector, there's an alternate path, which is not an exemption, which is instead of going for a carbon cap, going for a flat carbon reduction off of a baseline of 2018. And then there is also an alternate path for those institutions that find themselves 40% or greater above their cap. But it just really puts you into that alternate path, which is not necessarily better than going up against a carbon cap. And in fact, it penalizes institutions like Bob's, who have been making decades of investments in energy efficiency. To have them then measured against a 2018 baseline means that all of those efficiency improvements from 2000 to 2018 are not counted.
Yeah, I think the
great
key
point.
there is because there are so many different options, whether it's the prescriptive, the sort of, standard approach, or whether it's the 85% adjustment on 2018 or something else. Like you have to do an analysis and see which one makes the most sense, right? Because you could end up, going down a path that might not be the right solution kind of in the long term. So, yeah.
So I'm going to throw this one out to Jen, maybe Bob and Chris, you want to weigh in on it. It's one of the questions that came in. It's related to this. So I'm just going to read it out loud. As mentioned, approximately 80% of buildings should be okay for the first compliance period, but not okay for period 2, i.e. 2030. You expect challenges in carbon trading for the first period if majority of buildings fall below the cap and create too many sellers.
So I'm not sure that it's 80% of buildings that are going to be fine for the first period, but let's just assume so. And then 20% need to buy carbon credits. What we're seeing is that 80% of building types tend to be low energy intensity. So we would say, small commercial or multifamily housing that does not have sophisticated energy systems may be below their cap for that first period. Where you have the larger, more energy intensive users, healthcare, life sciences, data centers, who are going to need to buy carbon credits. I don't know that there is going to be a glut of supply coming from the low energy intensive, because even if it's 80% of building owners, it's not going to be 80% of the carbon credits that are needed, just given the differences in energy intensity, which is the amount of energy you're using over square feet. I think there's going to be a big demand for the credits.
Gotcha. This person's got some amazing questions. I'm going to throw another one out there as well. I'll keep it anonymous as to who it is, but I'm going to just again read it out loud. Are there any limits on renewable energy offsets that can be utilized from renewable sources, i.e. wind and solar, not in the metro area? For example, if a health system developed a wind farm elsewhere, can they use those credits as offset?
That
Well,
is a big question.
So,
It's a hot question right now, right?
Yeah. As the way I read the law, the renewable energy is only in Zone J for New York City. So if you built in Westchester, it wouldn't count. That's the way the law is written at the moment. Now, when you start talking about the governor's report saying that we can do renewable energy credits from upstate, the two laws don't actually match. So for us, there's a lot of ambiguity in the law, trying to figure out which way we want to go.
Yeah, could you weigh in on that? I know we talked a lot about the ambiguity in the law and what's written, what's not written. Any perspective on that?
So one thing that you can do, which is written in the law, is 10% of your carbon penalty can be addressed by buying carbon offsets. And those carbon offsets can be national, they can be international, they're fairly low cost products, but you are capped at only being able to address 10% of your exceedance with those products. And when we talk about renewable energy credits, the language of the law, which is what Bob was talking about, it states that those renewable energy generation sources must either be located within Zone J, which is the 5 boroughs of New York City, or sinking into Zone J as being directly connected. That is a sort of reference to the new CHPE project, where there's going to be a new transmission line proposed to bring hydro energy from Canada and plug it directly into Zone J, New York. That's the only project that I'm aware of that would meet that criteria of sinking into Zone J. That is going to create what's called a Tier 4 REC, which is a a hydro rec specific to that project. There is ambiguity in terms of the governor has included in his budget proposal the allowance of tier 2 New York State recs to be included as an offset in New York City. And it is creating a lot of confusion. It's also indicative of a greater sort of regulatory struggle between the state of New York and the city of New York on the issue of climate change.
I'm going to go off script for just a moment. I'm not throwing you a curveball, but we were going to talk a little bit about RECs and tier 2 and tier 4 a little bit later in the presentation. But can you just tell everybody what's a REC, what's tier 2, what's tier, all this terminology as it relates to, you know, the balance of carbon output of a particular building. Can you just tie a couple of those terms together for us?
Yes, so a REC is a renewable energy credit. So if I were to build a new renewable energy station in New York, I would have two products I could sell. I could sell my kilowatt hour production, and then for every kilowatt hour I produce, I also produce an invisible credit called a REC. And in doing so, I have two revenue streams to pay back my investment. And the reason to have a REC market is to encourage investment in new renewable energy stations, which traditionally cost more to permit, site, and construct than a traditional fossil generation station. So we create this new market to help promote more investment, more growth in the renewable sector. And New York State is fairly new to the REC market. And they have created what's called the New York GATS, which is a certification system through the New York ISO that verifies the renewable energy credits, verifies that they are coming from a renewable source. Tier 1 RECs are new renewable energy stations. They have a tier 1 REC that goes through the New York system, is certified. All of those RECs are owned by the state, and they are owned by NYSERDA, which is the Energy Research and Development Authority of the state. And they're then sold back to the retail ESCO providers of energy as part of the New York Clean Energy Standard. So every single customer in New York State is paying a surcharge through their bill, which goes towards the statewide REC program. Tier 2 RECs are basically the tier 1 RECs that have gone through their initial cycle with NYSERDA, and they now become available to potentially be purchased by end use customers for the first time to be used as a potential mitigation strategy, depending on this push-pull between the state and the city. You know, we have SRECs for solar, we have ORECs for offshore wind, and then we have the new tier 4 category, which is basically dealing with renewable energy that comes transmission systems. And that's really designed for the CHP project.
Gotcha. And the green power that's slated to come from Canada and basically connect right into the city, from my understanding, and this might be a little bit of murk, if you could clarify that. So my understanding, that's like a 30-year horizon. So this REC system, is this something that's gonna, I guess, incentivize people to create renewable energy sources to potentially get online sooner?
It is specifically developed to do that. It is specifically developed the entire system to bring more renewable energy to the state of New York. And we have two offshore wind farms, Sunrise and South Fork, at over 800 megawatts each. The TDI project, which is the CHPE transmission line, is going to bring 1,250 megawatts of renewable energy into New York. And all of this is downstate, where we tend to really struggle in terms of being able to site new power plants in general, but renewable energy, which requires additional space, is much harder to site downstate versus upstate.
And Chris, I think, you know, we're seeing some traction already, some interest. And I don't know, Jennifer, you can chime in here too, but you know, the theory is that the RECs are a cheaper way of achieving benefit than as opposed to upgrading your building systems. And like, you know, so in some way, right, it's helpful in the short term for folks to comply. But then in other ways, it's it's hurting the general trend of trying to move toward electrification for the good of the planet, to reduce carbon emissions, et cetera. So, from a short-term perspective, it's a windfall for some folks because it's a less expensive way of moving ahead. But we have to be careful that it doesn't become the do-all, end-all, and that we don't end up with buildings that are efficient, because then we're going to be in the same position that we talked about with Bob, where we have too much load that the grid can't handle, et cetera, right? So it's really a balance.
Gotcha. I mean, obviously, it's all forward thinking, great stuff, great input. Now I'm going to slam on the brakes, spin the car around 180 degrees and ask you, Chris, a popular design option, especially from an MEP perspective, because the high heating loads in hospitals, 24/7 and need for electricity, how does cogeneration fit into this whole picture?
Yeah, you're right. So, the 24/7 heating loads, right, as a result of reheat, and Bob brought up earlier, the air change requirements result in that reheat load. Hospitals require resiliency and for electricity and for heating sources. So cogen has been the solution of choice, right, for the past, 20 years. Having control over the generation of your own electricity and thermal on site. But, as I outlined earlier, with the carbon coefficients associated with gas, those are going to stay the same over time. They're not going to change. Although the law allows a revision to the carbon coefficients in the future, the gas one is presumed to stay the same, because for every bit of gas that you burn in your cogen plant, it's going to emit a certain amount of carbon. It's physics. There's no way around that, or chemistry. It's no way around that. And so, but if you're on electricity, right, if you're using grid electricity, the presumption is that that grid is going to become more green over time. And so the grid coefficient is going to change. So for a project that's invested in the cogen, that has this equipment on site, right, it's probably working for you really well right now, right? It's working really well for you in terms of resiliency. It's working really well in terms of the thermal energy. It's working really well in terms of the energy cost, right? The cost of gas to buy and then make your own electricity and thermal versus buying electricity from the grid is significant. It's about a 4 to 5 times difference in price to buy the electricity for the same unit of energy. So it's working for you right now, and it's working well. But when you start looking out 15 years, 20 years, we really think it's going to, the situation is going to change. I think the economics are going to change because of penalties. I think the economics might change because of utility fuel costs. But then also there's the policy side. I mean, if you look at what's happening in California, right, 41 cities now have some level of ban isn't the right term, but limitations on gas usage, whether it's new connections or enlargement or whatever. 41 cities in California. The mayor, I think last week, I actually didn't see the final reveal, but I know he was going to make an announcement to limit, any new gas connections in New York City starting in 2030. So I believe, I'm getting some nods, so I guess that did go through. So there's a real political momentum sort of pushing us away from fossil fuels. And I don't know that we've seen yet how that's going to show up in terms of fines or penalties or costs. There's something in Local Law 97 already, but maybe there's going to be more coming down the pipeline. I would think so. And so I guess the recommendation that I have is, it works now. It works really well now, and it should be part of the mix. It should be considered for a hospital because it's such a great usage case. But there needs to be a long-term strategy. You don't want to invest everything into it in such a way that you can't pivot or you can't adjust as things change, right? It needs to be a balanced strategy about maximizing benefit now from an energy cost standpoint, a resiliency standpoint, but also thinking about how you decarbonize and how you electrify and what does that look like in a way that makes sense in a cost-effective way. So it's again, this push and pull that we keep kind of revisiting here.
So Chris, can you give, we're so focused on New York. We know what the mayor has said in terms of gas connections going forward. Can we just give everybody a little perspective on a national scale? Have any states outlawed connections of natural gas?
Yeah, I think California are the only state so far that have done it. But yeah, across the country, I'm involved in a number of organizations that are represented across the country, and this is the conversation literally everywhere. Even in the deep parts, states like Texas, even there where it's super entrenched in fossil fuels, the conversations are around decarbonization because everybody recognizes that it's a national problem, a global problem. We have to make moves. So, there is legislation in Boston, for example, right now that's poised to be that passed the governor. It didn't pass the governor's office, or one of the branches that passed, but not the other. There's legislation in Boston that is going to be something similar to Local Law 97, a limit on carbon emissions. We know that there's discussions in Washington, D.C. about something very similar. So I think these things are going to start popping up very rapidly. I really believe that we're on sort of a one-way train here toward electrification, decarbonization. And so, the question is when does it make sense to get on the train in an effective way and in what capacity, right? But I think across the country, we're headed there.
So Stefan, just on the heels of Chris, from obviously his is the MEP perspective, from an architectural perspective, Bob had mentioned he's saving millions of dollars in operational costs because he's replacing, constant speed starters with variable speed drives. He's reducing air change rates. He's increasing efficiencies of mechanical systems. I want to put quotes around and say the MEP guys are tapped out. What is the architectural community doing with renovations and with new construction in terms of curtain wall design?
Well, first of all, we're a member of this team, right? And this is an integrated effort as ever. There was one. And as you're speaking, this is typical in these conversations, there's a complicated BIM model spinning in my head because everything that we're speaking of has a footprint. And so what should be obvious to everyone is that any planning effort, even from the smallest project to a larger one, has consequences and has become much more complicated now with all of these aspects that we've spoken about that are both known and unknown. I think there's an increasing importance in planning in a more sophisticated way, where early energy analysis is tied to, let's say, a more comprehensive cost model. We did a study for one of our healthcare clients here in the city where we realized that every unit of UI going from 174 to 173 represented an annual $1 million savings because of the narrow bandwidth of that net operating environment. You have to raise $20 for every dollar you spend on energy. And so it is really critical to optimize not only the systems you spoke of, but also the envelope systems. And they, of course, deliver on three fronts. One is the energy footprint, but also the patient experience, which is so critical to the healthcare program. And also, I think as new strategies and technologies really, I think, take advantage of every BTU, even those internally load-driven ones in a heat recovery strategy, that envelope is critical to making sure that those units of energy are not lost. So, I mean, from a high level, the planning is critical. And I think the importance of maintaining an active master plan nowadays is critical just because things are changing during the planning effort alone.
If there's any one thing I learned from you guys is master planning is an ongoing thing. It's not a snapshot in time.
Never.
It's a constantly going back and evaluate it. I don't know, and again, I'm throwing this out there. I'm not sure if you have any metrics, but are there any benefits to over insulating perimeter envelopes? Do we get anything back in terms of areas, the amount of square footage we could build? Is there, it's a long-term asset when you're looking at a new hospital building or a medical office building. These are 50, 60, 70-year assets. The value these amazing designs have. How do you fight off the value engineering to cut and to get a lesser performing wall?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's that cost model. We're all used to those cost models that look for paybacks within 7 years, and those are typically driving those passive strategies away from the capital budget, but then they do have a consequence later. And I also think the whole notion of what is over insulation, that also needs to be revisited now that we're not trying to lose energy anymore through the envelope, which is one way in which energy models have been evaluated. From a patient comfort standpoint and a peak load reduction strategy standpoint, the envelope does play a critical path, which the models need to reflect, especially in a time-based energy usage pattern and cost modeling pattern. I just think that we have to rely on fundamentals ultimately, and we have to be able to answer the question, what is the envelope doing for us from a heat loss standpoint? Architects really need to demonstrate that, I think, much more specifically because it's measurable now. But how that fits into the different cost models is what's unique, I guess, and it has multiple scales. And it also has to be evaluated properly. So scenario planning is critical. And then obviously understanding what the implications are on site, but beyond the site need to be really understood at a level of confidence that gives our client teams the ability to make a decision. And then we draw.
not the other way around, I guess.
No, it's both. It's in fact, you have to draw to help get to the decision, of course.
Draw it a few times, we'll
Yes.
get there. It is certainly an iterative process, and I guess to tie master planning that you just talked about with a little bit of what Chris talked about in terms of cogeneration and in terms of technology. Chris, what are the new things that are coming out there in terms of trying to hit this quote unquote electrification that local law 97 is kind of trying to guide us towards in reducing fossil fuels? Are there new technologies that we're presenting for projects that we need to weigh in with the architect to master plan spaces properly, so we don't kind of design ourselves out of a box in 2030?
Yeah, there are kind of, excuse me, there are new strategies and there are new technologies. So Bob alluded earlier about airside heat recovery. That's a strategy that, and a technology, but a strategy that's been around forever, but has not really been widely adopted. It's the heat wheels are sometimes difficult to maintain, and it's an extra piece of equipment. But we're about pushing these strategies that are going to reduce energy usage, like airside heat recovery, and really, trying to indicate, like what Stefan said about the real benefit on hour by hour basis and utility basis. And that's going to help us reduce those energy loads to begin with. The other one on the water side, heat recovery, is another strategy. The concept we have in our office that we say all the time, little slogan is, don't leave a BTU behind. When you're walking around on top of a building, a hospital, for any building, and you're outside doing a survey and it's cold out, you feel that giant gust of hot air coming out of an exhaust fan, right? That's a waste of energy. That's energy that you heated and cooled that you're now throwing away. So we got to save that. And we can do that with water side systems too. So, a cooling tower in the middle of the winter spewing out heat out into the environment. I mean, that's insane, right? Let's think about that, right? We have, on one hand, we're rejecting heat to the outside, paying energy to reject heat. And on the other hand, we're running a boiler, a cogen plant to make it up. So how do we pull them together, right? How do we save the energy? And so there are creative strategies, not even using new technology, but creative strategies that you have to implement right off the bat. But then to answer your actual question about technology, there's a lot of development with heat pumps right now. They do take up a lot of space, air source heat pumps that sit on the roof. They are a design consideration to Stefan's issue. They have to be planned for, hence that what I was saying earlier about the long-term planning to be able to pivot. They do take up a lot of space, but the technology is changing all the time. All the big manufacturers are releasing new products, increasing efficiency, better refrigerants, better turn down, smaller footprints. It is a continuous evolution, because right now there's so much focus on a nationwide scale. Everyone's asking, give me new products, I need to look at this. And so the manufacturers are seeing this, they're responding to, and they're developing new stuff. But on a simple level, electrification is about, heat pumps. It's about air source heat pumps that get integrated into a building or on the roof. And it's about, if you have space in a non-urban environment, ground source heat pumps or geothermal, right? There's a real opportunity there that even ups the ante even more in terms of energy efficiency. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of breaking it down. It's strategy and technology, and they're both, we need to work on both of them.
So Bob, the design team came about and talked about a lot of things. You're going to be faced with a lot of, new technologies and, different approaches, maybe even different operating approaches and how you train your folks. What are you expecting to see from the design community? Because, healthcare is very prescriptive. You have to have backup systems. Things need to be resilient. They need to be reliable. What do you expect to see, and how would your team interact with the design community to help get to that common ground?
From my end, it's doing what we have already done in an existing situation and designing it into new buildings. Doing life cycle costs of a building instead of first cost of a new building, to see which pieces of equipment will actually down the road save us energy. When you're building a new building and bringing in any new technology, you need to spend the time to train the staff that you have. And we're also videotaping that training so that when we bring on new staff, we can at least bring out the training modules for the staff to look at. And it's engaging your staff, showing them what you're doing and how that's going to help their job, and that'll help the institution. But it comes down to training, engaging the staff, engaging your consultants that are out there. Some of them have some great ideas. As long as they're not trying to defy the laws of physics, I like looking at the stuff. And there's plenty of guys out there defying the laws of physics. You're just trying to figure out how to get them out, but it's still interesting. But yeah, it's looking at the new technology, working with your consultants, and doing life cycle costs instead of just first cost.
I understand. Got it. Okay, we're in the red zone here. I got the time check note from Alana, so want to have a couple of minutes for questions. There's a couple more that came in, but if we could do a little power round, and Jen, we'll start with you. Just, we started at 40,000 feet. People are going to hang up in 7 minutes. What are the key takeaways that you would like to share with people? And I asked everybody else to jump in right after Jennifer.
The advisory that we are writing to clients and building owners is not to be too reactionary to local law 97, because so many elements of the law are in flux. Energy efficiency, which always made sense and always had payback, is only going to be better. So where we see some organizations being so terrified of this law that is so ill-defined, it's creating a bottleneck where they're going to take a wait and see approach. We are advising that it's so important to continue investing in efficiency. Efficiency has always made first. It's efficiency first, and then from the efficiency will come the greenhouse gas reductions, regardless of what happens with this law over time.
Right. Stefan?
Takeaway? Well, I would just like to encourage everybody who's facing this challenge to think of it holistically. Like every dollar that is spent on infrastructure should also offer a dollar of amenity, of improvement, right? There's a larger stakeholder group that's affected by all of these sort of challenges, but we have opportunities with this too. So I think there's a way in which to sort of plan for this cleverly, flexibly, but then also to achieve results that may be exceeding expectations. So I think that's the promise in all of this.
Bob?
From my end, it's always explore what can be done. Train your staff, teach them energy management, work with a partner to give them education, work with your consultants, speak with others, look at do what we're doing here. Keep getting educated on what's the next best thing to do.
Chris, key takeaway?
Yeah, Jennifer said it really well. I think there's just so much regulation, 84, 87, local 84, 87, local 97, the CLCPA, the RECs, the tier 2, the tier 4. It's easy to get lost and to get frustrated and do nothing because of the unknowns and the variables. And I just would like to say, that from a nationwide, from a global perspective, it's clear where we're headed. And, we got to head toward electrification in some capacity to the extent that we can do it, and use local law 97 as a framework to have the conversation and to make some, to help move you, but recognize that it's about heading in a direction in accordance with your companies or your businesses, capital planning efforts. So yeah, so just don't get stuck on all the regulation. Just head in the right direction, and I think it'll work itself out.
Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you all. I have a couple of questions to close out. We have a few minutes. To what extent are these facilities, and I'm reading this off the question box, facilities managers employing building management systems similar to what Rudin developed? Just so everybody knows, in case people don't know what Rudin developed, I think they have something like an energy dashboard so that they can pull up what's being consumed in each one of their buildings at any time, any given point in time. So, from an operational perspective, Bob, I know you've got everything monitored. You want to weigh in on that? What you see? And
so all of our buildings have building automation systems in there. We have energy measurement on all of our larger equipment. On our new buildings, we're down to floor level. On our older buildings, we're still at basically building level and on large equipment level. The more data or the more measurement you can do, the greater you can figure out where you're using your energy. It's just, once again, it's where can you spend your dollar most effectively? Is it measurement? Is it energy efficiency? Is it staff training?
Understood. Another good one here, maybe Jen, if you could take this one. How is the load on the grid capacity being managed? Is that solely Con Ed, or is it in conjunction with city and state governments?
So the reliability of the state grid, including New York City, is governed by the New York ISO. Con Edison is responsible and is the owner of the local transmission system. I think one of the sort of recurring themes and conversations that I've been having has been, how is Con Edison going to respond to a winter peak versus the way that they respond to a summer peak? So right now we are a summer peaking grid, and the way that Con Edison and the state respond to peak conditions is by calling, what's called a demand response call. And so anyone who is enrolled in demand response programs, many hospitals are, they make a commitment to curtail their electricity consumption when they're called. And many of the participants in the programs do so either by using on-site generation or by switching the assets within their chiller plant between electric. If we move and migrate to have a dual peaking system, summer and winter, all of that chiller load that is sort of switchable is no longer available to the grid to manage that peak. And so we have a lot of exposure where, blackouts in the summer are certainly dangerous and uncomfortable, but blackouts in New York City in the winter could have catastrophic consequences.
That's a great point. I hate to end on that down note, but it is 11:59 and I do want to respect everybody's time. So David and Joe, I'd like to hand it over to you to close it out. Panelists, I thank you very much for your time. Great insight, wonderful discussion. We could talk all day about this kind of stuff. So thank you all again.
No, this was certainly enlightening and educating. So thank you all. I do have one takeaway, sort of as we're, wrapping up, and to put Bob on the spot for 1 second. So Bob, we do have a series of, consultants online and a lot of different professionals, as an operator, sort of what are you looking for from your consultants? Sort of what is the level of support and how would you help sort of, guide, this team, at Building Congress, sort of as they're watching, what can you recommend in sort of moving forward and as a consultant, what can they help you with or other institutions?
For the consultants coming in, for me, it's most of my consultants that I've been working with I've been working with a while, and I trust them. But it's a relationship that's been built over many years. So if a new consultant's coming in, even if he's got the best things since sliced bread, we've got to build a trust. We've got to educate each other on, how we operate, how they operate, and try to figure out the best path forward.
Great. No, thank you.
Great.
And
Right.
now that I'm educated, I feel like, it's gonna help from my perspective, in the capital group, in the project management group of Memorial. Now, it just sort of, from my perspective, I think it's going to now taint, sort of how we move forward in a positive way to now, we need that collaboration. We need to understand, I think where, Stefan was going before, what does, how does the operations influence, the overall construction? We've always been cognizant. We always try to make that bridge and that collaboration. But I think this sort of just takes it to another level and to something we need to all be just a little more diligent of, as we go through the design documents. I think it's going to be an interesting, sort of evolution as we sort of march through this. So, I certainly appreciate the discussion and very enlightening, like I said. So thank you.
Mhm.
Joe?
So thank you. So on behalf of my co-chairs, Chris and David, I'd like to thank Bob, Chris, Jennifer, and Stefan. Your insight on something that has been talked about and is only beginning to really start a conversation in our industry right now, but definitely will be a big topic of discussion over the years to come. So we appreciate your insights and your guidance, and thank you again. And we look forward to continuing our conversations.
Thank you.
Alana?
All right, that is it. To echo Joe's sentiments, thank you very much, and we'll stay tuned for our next meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Take care.